Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock, and as of this recording is August 29th, 2024. Thanks for tuning in. Hope everybody's having a decent day. If you're stuck in traffic, I feel that pain. If you're not, more power to you. Hit the gas. I'm going to go ahead and get us started off with a factoid from World War I, and that's the Battle of the Somme, 1916. Between July 1st and November 13th, nearly 650,000 Germans, 420,000 British, and 195,000 French were casualties. The British suffered 57,470 casualties on the first day alone, of which 19,000 died. The British lost an entire battalion, 10th West Yorks, annihilated in 1 minute of their advance. For context, the United States lost 58,220 people in Vietnam. The British lost almost one-third that number in one single day. I bring it up to contrast the type of warfare that was being fought by European powers in 1919 versus the type of warfare that was fought in the jungles of Vietnam against the Japanese and against the French between 1940 and the end of the Vietnam War from the U.S. perspective in 1975. And we'll get into the details more, but there's a lot of focus on the ambush. Anyway, a little bit of unsolicited life advice. I recommend taking a daily probiotic. I've been on one. It's called Seed. Not getting paid by them, by the way, or anything. If you happen to feel really good after taking a probiotic for about 10 days now. So, highly recommended. And let's see, another piece of unsolicited cinema advice. The movie 8mm with Nicolas Cage and Joaquin Phoenix. A little gem, pretty creepy, pretty disturbing, good Halloween movie. So anyway, I mentioned guerrilla warfare, which is the primary method by which the Viet Minh waged war against the French and later the Americans. And so imagine you're patrolling through the bush and you're walking through the dense jungle and the high elephant grass, and you're thinking of either good things like a hot chick or food. And the other thing that you could be thinking about is the fact that you feel a deep sense of unease in the pit of your stomach. Your conscious mind can't put a finger on it, but something in your subconscious has picked up on an environmental clue that is telling you that danger is imminent. It could be the whiff of enemy soldiers nearby, undetectable except on the faintest levels of consciousness. It could be that the flora is disturbed ever so slightly compared to its immediate surroundings. It could be that all of a sudden you realize you stopped hearing the insects chirping or the birds singing. Or it could just be that you yourself thought, wow, if I were the enemy, this is exactly where I would lay an ambush. On a road, or in an open space, or on a heavily trafficked trail. There's elevated firing positions directly to my 12 o'clock that would provide perfect inflating fires to wipe out or pin down my entire company. And your company has been receiving intel reports that the nearest outpost, PK-69, was overrun 3 days ago. They fought and died to the last man, but all the weapons at the post, mortars, machine guns, maybe even artillery, has been acquired by the Viet Minh. But that's okay. That's to be expected. Your company is on a movement to contact mission. The whole point of which is for you to find the enemy by walking around in their territory until they start shooting at you. Then a 6-digit is sent up to higher headquarters so that they can track on their big-ass map board exactly where the most recent enemy contact is taking place. Now, you really hope that they send out enough guys on this patrol so that you don't get overrun. Maybe they have credible intelligence saying that the enemy strength is maxed out and one company will outnumber them significantly. But it's the jungle. You don't know. Nobody knows. That's the whole point that you're in the movement to contact mission in the first place. Because if they knew, they wouldn't be sending you out there to get shot at. The sad truth of jungle warfare is that the canopy is so thick, the vegetation so dense, you're not going to see jack shit from the sky. You got to send troops in. You got to send in the infantry. You don't know, and you don't want to know. But higher headquarters knows. 27 soldiers are killed daily for these kinds of missions. Sure, you'll kill 3 times as many, but the Viet Minh, they got nothing to lose. Their lives suck. They're poor. They've been mistreated by your country. They've been segregated, isolated, marginalized, beat down for 100 years, and they're really, really f***ing pissed. And right at the exact moment that you're contemplating all of this, the shit hits the fan, and you watch it unfold in slow motion. First, muzzle flashes from machine guns. 12 o'clock, 300 meters, a third of the way up a steep hill. Then, at the 2 o'clock, you see about 10 muzzle flashes in random sequence, and you hear the sounds of bullets whizzing around. You hit the deck, but you're in elephant grass, and you can't see jack anymore. All you hear is yelling, screaming, dying, and machine gun and AK-47 fire. You're shocked, scared shitless. Your mouth is dry. Maybe you pissed yourself. Your squad leader gets up on a knee and starts unloading at the wood line. The sound is deafening, but you know what you gotta do. You gotta follow suit. You're shooting in the right direction, but you don't know what you're looking at. All you see is shadows of the trees in the deep jungle. And then all of a sudden, the shadows come to life and you see 12 figures bobbing about. Sometimes there's a flash, then they're gone. First the bullets are whizzing, then they're snapping. As soon as you notice the difference, the most excruciating pain you've ever felt in your whole life blossoms from your abdomen. You're writhing in pain. You're not looking, but if you were, you'd see that Sarge just took shrapnel to the face from a frag. You're unconscious now, blissfully unaware. Your body just took some frag, and the blast knocked you unconscious. It sent your body tumbling down an embankment into the irrigation ditch of the rice paddy you were patrolling through. Fortunate to be alive. Maybe not. But your body is shielded by the irrigation ditch as mortars explode all around you. Anybody caught not kissing dirt is liable to get shredded by shrapnel or turned to Swiss cheese by machine gun fire, maimed by a hand grenade, or engaged in hand-to-hand combat by enemy Viet Minh charging from the flank. Conscious now, and racked with burning agony from your gunshot wounds and shrapnel, you're vaguely aware of the hell unfolding around you. The impossibly loud cacophony of industrialized annihilation drowns out all else and consumes every ounce of your being in that moment. As such, you don't really remember what came first, the swoosh or the blast of the bomb, but one thing is for sure, in front of you is a massive wall of flames, the heat more intense than the visage. Feels like the time your dipshit buddies back home in Nebraska threw a gasoline canister on the bonfire. Main difference being, back then 3 dozen men weren't getting fried alive before your very eyes. You don't care, and why would you? The agonizing wall of flames and the scorching heat are the only things keeping the Viet Minh from running over your position and killing to the last man. And it's right then that you realize, yeah, I am fortunate to be alive. As you're looking up at the sky, growing faint from blood loss, you see the flame turn to smoke and wisp away into the wild blue yonder, and you wonder to yourself if you won't turn to spirit and dissipate in the same manner. Okay, so I think at this point we might be ready to talk about the French Indochina War. I know that was a little bit dramatic, but you gotta set the mood. Last episode we talked about how Ho Chi Minh wrote a letter to the post-World War I powers, and while he started with many platitudes, he ultimately was asking for 8 things for the Vietnamese people. Those 8 things were: 1, general amnesty for all the native people who had been condemned for political activity; 2, reform of the Indo-Chinese justice system by granting to the native population the same judicial guarantees as the Europeans; 3, freedom of speech and press; 4, freedom of association and assembly; 5, freedom to immigrate and to travel abroad; 6, freedom of education; 7, replacement of the regime of arbitrary decrees by a regime of law; 8, a permanent delegation of native people elected to attend the French Parliament in order to keep the latter informed of their needs. Okay, so even though Ho Chi Minh's call for freedom for the Vietnamese people is endearing, especially to the United States citizen, it should be noted that at the time that he wrote that letter in 1919, he was just a 29-year-old socialist activist living in France. He did not hold an official position in either the government of France or the government operating under the French flag in Vietnam. He was just a social justice warrior. So as you can imagine, the French government was like, oh, cool, this guy's writing a letter. Who gives a fuck? The French said, oh, oui, a fuck you, and a fuck you, and especially a fuck you. So even though Ho Chi Minh's words fell on deaf ears with the French and also the other international powers of the time, by 1944, the United States had a favorable attitude towards the Vietnamese independence struggle. In a memo written to the Secretary of State on January 24th, 1944, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote the following, quote, I saw Halifax last week and told him quite frankly that it was perfectly true that I had, for over a year, expressed the opinion that Indochina should not go back to France, but that it should be administered by an international trusteeship. France has had the country, 30 million inhabitants, for nearly 100 years, and the people are worse off than they were at the beginning. As a matter of interest, I am wholeheartedly supported in this view by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and by Marshal Stalin. I see no reason to play in with the British Foreign Office in this matter. The only reason they seem to oppose it is that they fear the effect it would have on their own possessions and those of the Dutch. They have never liked the idea of trusteeship because it is, in some instances, aimed at future independence. This is true in the case of Indochina. Each case must, of course, stand on its own feet, but the case of Indochina is perfectly clear. France has milked it for 100 years. The people of Indochina are entitled to something better than that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR ultimately passed away before he had a chance to influence the Allied decision makers that were in charge of organizing the disarmament of the occupying Japanese soldiers at the end of World War II. The Allies decided that China would oversee the evacuation of the Japanese troops in the north, and Britain would oversee the evacuation of the Japanese troops in the south. Now, if you'll recall, we talked about Ho Chi Minh's assumption of power in 1945. That was September 2nd, 1945, where he proclaimed to, by all accounts, a ecstatic crowd that the French have fled, the Japanese have capitulated, Emperor Bao Dai has abdicated, our people have broken the fetters which for over a century have tied us down. He also quoted from the United States Declaration of Independence saying, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He even continued on to say that, quote, this immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the people on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live. to be happy and free. And this was a blatant appeal from Ho Chi Minh to the United States to not only draw a parallel between Vietnam's struggle for independence, but also the American Revolution, and to appeal to our heartstrings to provide aid. Okay, so according to some sources, and by some sources, I mean according to the Ken Burns documentary, Ho Chi Minh wrote multiple letters to President Truman that were never given to the president. They never reached his desk. Now, I did some digging on the internet for like a couple minutes, and I haven't seen much in the way of definitive evidence that that's the case. I found a Vietnamese article from a Vietnamese website called vietnamnet.vn, which basically says that, quote, during the 2 years, 1945 to 1946, President Ho Chi Minh sent 8 letters and telegrams to President Harry Truman and 3 letters and telegrams to Secretary of State James Byrne. Now, whether or not there was 8 of them sent, we do know for sure of at least 2 of them. The first one is dated January 18th, 1946, from Ho Chi Minh to President Truman. And I won't read it verbatim, but I'll give you a gist. It basically says, hey, Mr. President, you're doing a great job maintaining peace and world order, but you should be aware that the situation with France is going to lead to a lot of death and suffering. Basically, during World War II, the French caved to the Japanese. The Vietnamese people, however, were fighting against the fascist Japanese. 9 million people turned out to vote in 1946, but the French were collaborators with the Japanese. And, oh, by the way, in March 1945, the Japanese beat the French again. So, frankly, why not just let Vietnam be a free republic? It's going to save a lot of lives, and please give us your support. Obviously, there's way more words, and it's much more elegant than that, but that is the gist of what he said. If you want to, you can look it up. It is offered to the public by the United States National Archive. On February 28th, 1946, Ho Chi Minh relayed a telegram from Hanoi through the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. You'll remember them from last episode. They had a station in China, and he relayed a telegram to President Truman basically saying the return of French troops and also French civilians working with French troops were preparing a coup in Hanoi against Ho Chi Minh. And he was saying, please, I personally am appealing to you, President Truman, and the American people to interfere in support of our independence. Despite repeated attempts by Ho Chi Minh to appeal to the United States for support, alas, the United States did not give support to the Vietnamese. In fact, the United States pretty much wholly supported the French in their bid to reclaim their former colonial asset. Nearly 1 year after that February telegram to President Truman in 1946, President Truman declared to the public on March 12, 1947, it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Now, President Truman wasn't talking about Indochina at that time. He was talking about Greece and Turkey, which were basically on the verge of collapse and or control by communists. In Greece, there was a insurgent group known as National Liberation Front, which was waging a communist insurgency to exploit the post-World War II horrible economic conditions that Greece was facing. And in Turkey, the situation was a little bit different, but basically the Soviets were pressuring this Turkish government to let the Soviets share control of the Dardanelles Straits, which is an extremely vital shipping corridor. And so this situation with Turkey and Greece was the beginning of the so-called Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine is basically United States foreign policy of the time that said if a few countries fall to communists, then it's likely to spread. Or as one domino falls and knocks over another domino, so too will one country fall to communism, and then knock over another country to communism. And so it's important to remember that this is the end of World War II. We always like to think in America that the end of World War II was the beginning of pretty much American excellence and the rest doesn't really apply to us, so we don't really care that much. But the fact of the matter is a lot of countries were affected drastically different from the United States in terms of how World War II ended and how they started to rebuild. A lot of countries were racked by economic damage from the war effort, and it was ripe conditions for disgruntled people to buy into the communist manifesto, for lack of a better term. Since Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution of 1918 and the subsequent formation of the Soviet Union, it was, the new hotness on the world stage. The Soviet Union had done an excellent job of purging all dissent and pretty much creating a very well-oiled propaganda machine that was spreading its tentacles to all the disaffected poor people and oppressed of the world over. But while communism has obviously negative connotations to the Westerner in 2024, in 1946, 47, right after World War II, communism was still an idea that hadn't really been tested. It had been by the Soviet Union, and the consequences were terrible. But to the progressive American and the progressive Westerner writ large, communism hadn't been tested, and the effects of communism, the brutal and terrible effects of communism, hadn't been widely reported upon. Now, people in the State Department and people in the government knew about communism. They knew about the Soviet Union. They knew what was going on there. And it wasn't a secret. It just wasn't something that was widely broadcast to the world, just in World War II, the Soviet Union was pretty heroic and very instrumental to defeating Nazi Germany, and also were the first ones to enter Berlin and basically knock out Berlin, knock down the Nazi high command. So my point is that communism wasn't widely viewed as something nefarious or sinister until the Truman Doctrine really came onto the scene, and that was when Truman gave his address, March 12th, 1947. All right, so I'm going to put to rest the whole Ho Chi Minh's attempts to appeal to the United States topic for now, and we're going to get into, what were the French doing that was so bad in the first place? Like, how bad could it really have been? Like, were the French that bad? I mean, it's France. How bad could they be? So first, real quick, I'm just going to note here that the Vietnamese endured basically 1,000 years of Chinese rule before they pushed them out in 938 AD. The Chinese came back several times, but ultimately by 1426, the Vietnamese people expelled China once and for all out of their homeland, and the Chinese basically never came back. However, by the end of the 1800s, there was a period where all the European superpowers at the time, that's Germany, France, Britain, Belgium, etc., were making mad, hard, brutal pushes to secure colonial outposts in Africa and in the South China Sea and a lot of other places. In May 1883, the French National Assembly voted 5 million francs for an expedition to basically bring the Vietnamese area into a protectorate. 20,000 French troops fought for about a year. They ultimately gained control of the country, and once they were in control, they were pretty brutal. They would behead anybody that was dissenting against French rule. And if that wasn't bad enough, the French basically started exporting opium and refining opium and basically got a ton of people hooked on opium. Kind of reminds me of the old Purdue Pharma and Sackler family fiasco If you don't know what I'm talking about, it might be worth looking up. Anyway, the French got to Vietnam and they basically started a land grab, kind of like how we did with the American West. By the 1930s, a few hundred families of French colonial make basically possessed the majority of wealth and resources and screwed over the poor Vietnamese farmers. As the United States was successful with indoctrinating the Native American people into the Western way of life, so too were the French successful in indoctrinating a large swath of the Vietnamese population into French culture, education, and language, which is normally the justification that Western powers said to themselves to justify their exploitation over the indigenous. It was always, well, yes, we are disrupting their previous ways and modes of existence, but in return, we're bringing them culture, education, a better way of life, civilization, if you will. And as you might imagine, the middle and upper class Vietnamese folks were those who were educated in French customs. They grew up in French schools. They spoke French very well. They worked with French people, but reportedly there was a pretty significant segregation where, French colonialists and native Vietnamese indoctrinated in French culture might get along and might be work associates. There were not a whole lot of publicly accepted friendships outside the workforce. By the 1930s, rural areas were seeing an uptick in insurgency activity. Many of the peasant class Vietnamese were taxed unfairly. They didn't hold any property of their own, and they were still taxed on, what little property they may have had. And a lot of them were imprisoned for not paying taxes. And according to Max Hastings, the eminent historian, by 1943, almost half of Vietnam's land was in the hands of less than 3% of its farmers. So in addition to the system, the French system, where 3% of the population controlled the majority of real estate, the French were also doing other things that were kind of screwing over the local native Vietnamese individual. They would prioritize the exportation of certain resources such as rice, rubber, and coffee, which would come at the expense of local farmers and thereby local community economies. In a nutshell, 100 years of French colonialism in Vietnam created a situation where there was a very small elite class of individuals in society and a very large class of poor peasants in society. Because of the fact that there were such drastic social distinctions between the peasant class and the upper echelon, upper crest class, and because most of those peasant class people worked in rural areas supporting the extraction and refinement of natural resources that were profiting only the French and the middle to upper crest Vietnamese, these class disparities became perfect conditions for the diabolical tenets of communism to take root in the hearts and minds of the oppressed, right? So given those factors, and now add into the mix a very charismatic leader such as Ho Chi Minh, who we're about to talk about in detail next, it's easy to see how communism was able to spread to the disaffected peasant class of Vietnam. Oh yeah, and lest I forget, and before I start talking about Ho Chi Minh, remember World War I? Well, 100,000 Vietnamese were mobilized to fight for France in Europe, and upwards of 30,000 perished fighting or serving during World War I. When thinking about the French colonialism and treatment of the Vietnamese people and the Indochinese people writ large, I just can't help but think about like the Galactic Empire, freaking Darth Vader, stormtroopers, or even Dune with the Harkonnens basically raping the Fremen for their worm spice production. what you'll find is that books like Dune and movies like Star Wars were really capitalizing on current affairs, the issues of the time. And the issues of the time was the Cold War, capitalism versus communism, the legacy of colonialism, the decolonization process, the effects of fascism, addressing and remediating the damages caused by exploitative capitalism. I think you get the gist, so I'll go ahead and get back on topic. Ho Chi Minh, aka Bringer of Light. His given name was Nguyen Sinh Gong, and he was born in 1890 in central Vietnam. He was expelled from high school in 1908 for, quote, revolutionary activity, after which he taught briefly in a village school, and then in 1911 he became a coal stoker and galley boy aboard a French freighter. He wandered the earth for 3 years, even spent some time in the United States. He was even a pastry chef in London at one point. He could speak English and French fluently, and he also knew several Chinese dialects, and he even learned Russian. In 1920, he was a speaker at a French socialist gathering, and he said the following: "It is impossible for me in just a few minutes to rehearse to you all the atrocities committed in Indochina by the bandits of capitalism. There are more prisons than schools. Freedom of the press and opinion does not exist for us. We don't have the right to immigrate or travel abroad. They do their best to intoxicate us with opium and brutalize us with alcohol. They massacre many thousands to defend interests that are not Vietnamese." And that's a paraphrase from Max Hastings' book, Vietnam, an Epic Tragedy, 1945 to 1975. Another quote that I'm going to read from Max Hastings' book, attributed to Ho Chi Minh. He said in 1927, "I always thought I would become a scholar or writer, but I've become a professional revolutionary. I travel through many countries, but I see nothing. I'm on strict orders, and my itinerary is carefully prescribed, and you cannot deviate from the route, can you?" It's unclear what Ho Chi Minh really means by that sentence, but there's a lot of speculation that Ho Chi Minh was basically financially supported, logistically supported, ideologically groomed to be a spreader of communist ideology by the Soviets. And you got to think this was the mid to late 20s, 1930s. You know, who's keeping track of what Ho Chi Minh's up to during that time? You know, the West not. The West didn't have the intelligence apparatus that it has now. It didn't have the internet, and there wasn't a digital record of everything. So it's very possible that Ho Chi Minh was in fact being handled by the Soviets. One thing is certain, and that is Ho Chi Minh had quite an effect on the disaffected peasant class Vietnamese people, and also Vietnamese that had strong nationalistic visions for their own independence. One person described him as having, quote, imperturbable dignity that enveloped him as though it was a garment. Ho Chi Minh didn't actually return to Vietnam until 1941, and it was then that he adopted the pseudonym Ho Chi Minh, or Bringer of Light. Now, it might just be me, but anybody who calls themselves a Bringer of Light, I have questions. I have serious questions. Many of his followers affectionately called him Uncle Ho, and even to this day, Ho Chi Minh is referred to as Uncle Ho. Once returned to Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh set up camp in a cave in northern Vietnam, where he and a bunch of guerrilla fighters began their resistance effort against Imperial Japan and also the French. On May 19th, 1941, Ho Chi Minh, Bao Nguyen Giap, and Pham Van Dong, and another individual named Lý Duan, they created the League for the Independence of Vietnam, also known as the Viet Minh. However, prior to Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, there was a independence party called the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, created in 1927. They were really the first to pose an organized resistance against French colonial rule. In 1930, the Vietnamese Nationalist Party led a general uprising against the French designed to oust the colonialists, unify the country, and create a republic. This caught the French off guard at first, but they quickly crushed the uprising, rounded up a bunch of prisoners, sent them off to a notorious prison called Palo Condor, and they guillotined the leader of the uprising, Nguyen Thai Hoc. Before getting his head lopped off, Mr. Nguyen Thai Hoc goes down in history as screaming, "Vietnam Van Tu! Long live Vietnam." I'm only bringing up this little nugget of history to explain that the Viet Minh weren't the only resistance groups. They weren't the only nationalistic groups. In fact, they weren't even the first nationalistic group. And by 1945, when Ho Chi Minh declares Vietnamese independence, there was a pretty wide rift among the populace. Some were pro the Viet Minh, others were pro the Vietnamese Nationalist Party and other nationalist groups. There wasn't a unified front at that time. In fact, the only thing preventing full-scale civil war between the pro-Viet Minh and the pro-VNQDD, which is the acronym for the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, the only thing that prevented massive outbreak of civil conflict right then and there was the fact that at the end of 1945, the Chinese, who were at that time a United States ally and who had not yet succumbed to communist control, came down from the north, seized control of everything north of the 16th parallel, and were there to help extirpate the Japanese from the north, while the British were in control of extirpating the Japanese from the south. Now, up until the time that the Chinese withdrew all their forces out of Vietnam on June 17th, 1946, the Viet Minh tolerated the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, even though they were fierce rivals and did not have the same vision. They were not united by communist ideology. And the Vietnamese Nationalist Party had a paper that mocked Ho Chi Minh. It framed the Viet Minh as internationalist communists. They were going to betray the country in the end. And so once the Chinese finally left Vietnam, the Viet Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam government orchestrated a widespread crackdown on all opposition papers and anybody who was a competitor in the field of nationalism or who had dissenting voices against the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh gained control of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, replaced its key leaders, effectively creating just a separate satellite puppet group. This caused the Viet Minh to consolidate power. Okay, so while the Viet Minh were consolidating control in the north, in the south, the story was a little bit different. On September 12th, 1945, 10 days after Ho Chi Minh's independence declaration, British troops arrived in Saigon. Their goal was to gain control of the south. They fought aspiring Viet Minh who were fighting for power of the city, and in many cases, the Japanese were deployed alongside the British and Indians to fight the Viet Minh. Also, the British freed French colonists that had been held in prison by the Japanese. And yes, I did say that Japanese forces were deployed alongside the British to quell Viet Minh uprisings. Isn't that wacky? About 3,000 Japanese soldiers thought so. They defected and went north or stayed south to help Viet Minh resistance movements by providing training and other support where available. So anyway, when Major General Douglas Gracie, the British commander sent to receive the Japanese surrender, when he arrived in Saigon, he found that the state of affairs was pretty abysmal. He allowed approximately 1,000 French prisoners of war to be rearmed and reorganized to help gain control of Saigon and kick out the Viet Minh. By September 23, 1945, the rearmed and reorganized prisoners of war, supported by British troops, had successfully regained control of the majority of Saigon, and in the subsequent days, they regained control of the entirety of the city. Seeing the success of the French and British troops against the Viet Minh caused the local French population to rise up in jubilation and riot against the native population in the city. In retaliation, on September 24th through 25th, the Vietnamese mob entered Saigon and lynched 150 civilians while also abducting a similar number. Additionally, outside of Saigon, Viet Minh soldiers set up roadblocks and accidentally killed OSS agent A. Peter Dewey. the first American to be killed in Vietnam. Chaos continued to ensue for the next several days as British patrols would encounter Viet Minh and engage in skirmishes. The Viet Minh took heavy losses with each encounter. Once expelled from Saigon, Viet Minh troops set up roadblocks and ambushed convoys, trying to strangle the city and cut off all supply lines to the city. Despite the Viet Minh's best efforts, they continued to get smoked by British, Indian, and Japanese soldiers. Even though the Viet Minh lost many people and ultimately failed to regain control of Saigon, the effort wasn't in vain because while French forces arrived early in October 1945, it took them a year to regain control of the North, during which time the Viet Minh were reconsolidating, reorganizing, refitting, and recruiting more people for their war efforts. Also, January 4th, 1946, the Viet Minh held an election which was by most accounts a sham election that was rigged from the start and did not accurately reflect the will of the people, but was nevertheless the impetus that the Viet Minh required to consolidate power and continue to champion their legitimacy in the eyes of the world. On March 6, 1946, after receiving pressure from Western allies, the French government basically met with Ho Chi Minh and signed an agreement that officially gave Vietnam independence as, quote, a free state with its own government, parliament, army, and finances, forming part of the Indochinese Federation and the French Union. Additionally, this agreement allowed the French to have a military presence in Vietnam for the following 5 years. A lot of hardliner commies were pretty upset because they considered this to be just repeating the same cycle of colonialism. And to their point, it does seem that the French started to exert colonial control like they had before. They set up a blockade of Haiphong, which prompted the Viet Minh to ask the French to go back to the negotiating table to discuss adding provisions to the agreement that they had previously signed. On July 6, 1946, Ho Chi Minh went to Paris to discuss the future of Vietnam with French heads of state. They gave him pomp and circumstance, but ultimately it was an empty show for empty promises. The French refused to revise the original treaty in any way. Ho Chi Minh ultimately signed a modus vivendi, postponing the talks to a later date, but these talks were never to occur because of an outbreak of violence that began in late November. On November 20th, 1946, a French patrol intercepted a Chinese vessel, discovered that they were carrying contraband. This seizure led to an armed clash where Vietnamese soldiers started shooting at the French ship from the shore. They killed 23 soldiers. This incident led to a skirmish between Vietnamese and French nationals, which caused for a French burial party to get ambushed, leading to 6 more deaths. News of this ended up on an admiral's desk in Paris, where he reached out to the French commander of Indochina forces, and he ordered them to use force against the Vietnamese of Haiphong. An order to the commander of French forces at Haiphong stated, quote, it appears clear that we are up against premeditated aggressions carefully staged by the Vietnamese regular army. The moment has come to give a severe lesson to those who have treacherously attacked you. Use all the means at your disposal to make yourself complete master of Haiphong. The commander of French forces at Haiphong, Colonel de Bay, issued an ultimatum to the Vietnamese, telling them that they had to get out of the French section and Chinese sections of the city, including the port area. He also invoked a Franco-Chinese agreement from February 28, 1946, as justification. He argued that the treaty gave France protective rights over the Chinese in Vietnam and thus gave them jurisdiction to engage. By November 28, 1946, Colonel de Bay had regained control of the city after a fierce naval bombardment annihilated the Vietnamese quarter. Modern estimates of the body count put the number between 2,000 to 6,000 people. At the time, the U.S. consulate reported around 2,000 killed. Ho Chi Minh himself reported in a letter around 3,000 killed, but the Viet Minh spread the rumor that 10 to 20,000 were killed. Whatever the true number, 10,000, 6,000, 3,000, even 2,000, that's an insane number of people to die in one naval bombardment. This incident unfortunately destroyed any prospect of peace between the people of Vietnam and the French, and ultimately caused the conditions to be firmly set for the Battle of Hanoi, which began December 19th, 1946, which we'll go into detail next episode. I'm going to wrap it up here. Hope everybody learned something. Hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you next episode. And I want to give a special shout out, as always, to the folk over at www.zapsplat.com who provided the sound effects that you've heard here today. All right, take it easy, everybody.